Welcome to DejaVue.
Your favorite Vue podcast? You just don't know it yet. Or maybe you do, because, well, we are very much on to the second half of our interview with Avenue. But who is Vue? If you haven't heard it, well, check out the last episode. But I'm Alexander Lichter. I'm a web engineering consultant, part of the Nuxt team, and also do video content around Vue, Nuxt, JavaScript, and TypeScript. And with me is the one and only Michael Thiessen.
Hey, I also do some content. I actually do this as my full-time job, educating you and everyone else about Vue and Nuxt with articles and courses and books. And yeah, this is the second part of our conversation, which we had a great one. So it went quite long. And so we decided to split this up into two sections.
Exactly. So, as I mentioned before, check out the previous episode for the first part, but you can also jump straight away in the second part if you're into Vue 4. Yeah, spoiler, alert, and some other questions from the Q&A that we did before. So, yeah, let's don't wait too long and jump in straight away.
So we've talked about Vue 1, we've talked about Vue 2, Vue 3. Do you have any plans currently for Vue 4?
We have some ideas floating around. Actually, I have a little list of things that might happen in Vue 4, but a lot of them will actually need proper RFCs. So they're kind of like in the phase of where we need to discuss with the community to see if this is feasible. For example, one thing is like in define props, the way that we do Boolean casting causes a mismatch between so if you declare an optional Boolean prop, its default value will be automatically casted to false instead of undefined. So it actually creates a mismatch at type level because there's no way for you to properly declare this. Say when you declare like Boolean, an optional property that's of Boolean type, you expect it in typeland its value is true, false, or undefined. But in reality, it's only true or false. It will never be undefined. So many people actually consider this a bug, but I think there are existing code that rely on this behavior, so changing it would be a breaking change. And also, having to cast booleans, this boolean casting rule is just one thing that's, I think it has some historical issues, like the order in the types you declare. For example, if you declare it can be either a string or a boolean, then the order of them affects how they're casted.
Oh, interesting.
So a lot of these little things we actually had to have pretty intricate internal workarounds or implementation details, which I think probably shouldn't exist in the first place. So that's one thing we might want to just remove. And then ref unwrapping in objects. This is something actually creates a bunch of issues. For example, so when you nest a ref inside a reactive object, right, you access it and automatically unwraps the ref. We did it mostly for initial convenience when we expected a lot of mixed usage of reactive and refs, but that had unintended consequences, especially in type, is because now we have create a type called unwrap refs recursively. So it's like a recursive type that tries to unwrap all the refs nested in the reactive object. And actually, that makes the return type of reactive incompatible with the original type, because an original type can contain nested refs, but when it becomes wrapped in reactive, all those refs are unwrapped. So now the types mismatch. This also creates issues in, for example, refs inside an array will not be unwrapped, but refs inside an object will get unwrapped. So in hindsight, this is probably a design mistake we wanted to rectify, but it's kind of tricky how to make the migration smooth because this can have implications in some pretty tricky runtime behavior stuff. But we'll try to come up with a plan to allow people to kind of narrow it down and try to find the cases where they're actually relying on this behavior. I think the easiest way is we will ship a build that just have the rectified types. And you'll find a lot of errors in typeline where you can fix. And then we'll probably have internal flag where if we detect you're accessing a nested ref in a reactive object, we'll try to warn you about it, telling you the value is no longer unwrapped, it's giving you the raw ref back. So definitely this will also require an RFC. We'll need to talk in depth about the migration strategies and everything. But I think overall that would just make things more consistent, less confusing. Like we actually,
Definitely.
yeah, when I was writing this relevant section in the docs, I was like,
It doesn't
yeah,
feel
it's
right.
really hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels, it's very difficult to explain. Yeah, and then I think in Vue 4, there's some things like in Vue 4 we may consider like raising the browser support range again, but that kind of heavily depends on timing. We may have to like defer it until a further major version. But some things we're looking for is like native CSS scoping,
Oh, yeah.
native signals. Native signals might be further down the road, but native CSS scoping is actually, I think, much closer.
Yeah.
And if it lands in a decent amount of like browser range support, we can we'll definitely like offer a mode where you can opt in to say now SFC scoped CSS will just compile to native scoped. It will generate lighter CSS, lighter HTML markup. It if in a future version we're able to completely drop the current scope CSS implementation, it's also going to simplify the internals quite a lot because scope IDs are actually a pretty complex thing to handle, like because it's just like very pervasive. We have to have scope ID handling at all stages in client rendering, in server-side rendering, in hydration. It's just quite annoying. So I'm looking forward to be able to just like move over to native scope CSS and get rid of that.
One less thing to worry.
Yeah, but it's mostly like kind of like a browser baseline requirement thing. It won't affect the user by anything, right? So as I mentioned, we definitely want to focus on either it's fixing a mistake or it's something that would be technically breaking but won't really require you to do much on your end.
Like better defaults, for example.
Yeah. I think one thing that might be controversial is, for example, we're thinking about defaulting script to setup mode. So essentially, without setup, it'll be it works like script setup nowadays. So we're just like flipping it around. So the other script will be like script module, which runs in module scope, and the default script is just setup. And we're also thinking about maybe defaulting to TypeScript directly in the script as well. So this is also going to be a controversial one. So
For
for
sure.
sure, we're going to have an RFC for that, right? So I'm actually like, initially I was skeptical about this too, but Astral actually has been doing this since the very beginning. So the script part in Astral components are TypeScript by default. Kevin actually raised this as a discussion item in the Vapor repo, and a lot of people didn't like it, right? But I think the idea behind this is when people think about TypeScript by default, they worry about all the extra complexity that comes with TypeScript, like configuration or like getting the types right and all that. The thing is, it all comes down to how you handle the default developer experience when you are not writing TypeScript in a TypeScript setting. Right? So because TypeScript is syntactically a superset of JavaScript. So any JavaScript you write is actually valid TypeScript. There might be type errors, but we don't have to enable, like, for example, you don't have tsconfig.json. We don't have to be in strict mode. It's just going to be the most lenient type checking as possible. Anything unannotated is going to be any, right? So you're going to just be like writing normal JavaScript. If we don't tell you, you probably won't even realize it's TypeScript by default. That's the idea, right? So for people who not into into TypeScript, they can just keep writing the JavaScript they like. But it actually allows us to give you a bit better IntelliSense and type checking compared to plain JavaScript. Right. So that's one thing. I think the other aspect of it is people like the explicitness, like knowing. I think the only concern that we have is people started seeing TypeScript syntax inside a plain script tag, and they'll be like, "Whoa, what is this?" Right? Some people actually have. We actually had this feature request in Vue for quite a long time, and people want this behind a feature flag or an option that you can toggle. But I think having an option in the current Vue 3 will be actually very confusing, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So, but if we couple it with a major version like Vue 4, that might make a lot more sense. It's like, oh, you're seeing TypeScript syntax in the default script. It must be Vue 4, right? Also, you're seeing composition API in the plain script. That's Vue 4. It doesn't really fundamentally change the way you would write your components. It's really just like writing less, a bit of less. Or maybe in the RFC discussion, someone will convince us like this is not worth it, you know. But I think overall, it's just like over time, we really acknowledge how our user base kind of changed and shifts over time. Like in the early days, probably 90% no build step, 10% with build tools. Vue 2 era, probably 50-50. Vue 3 era, probably even more build tools, more composition API, right? So we kind of always want to optimize the framework for the most dominant use case to put most people on a happy path.
Yeah, like the 80% solution at least.
Yeah. So that's the main motivation. And then I think one of the more difficult ones is we may want to eventually remove the requirement for you to always declare all the props. So right now, like you can already use types to declare props in SFCs, right? For a lot of people, that's great. But the problem is at runtime, Vue still needs to know the exact list of props this component expects in order to differentiate props from ATTRs or fall-through attributes. This actually creates a problem because now we actually built a pretty sophisticated like reverse compiler that parses your types and try to infer the final list of props you expect from this type, right? We actually had to do all of that in Vue, and there's still a lot of edge cases we don't support, and it's kind of like a rabbit hole that's kind of endless. Like we supported like probably most of the common use cases people see, but if you use like crazy stuff like generics, key of, index types, mapped types, you know, people do crazy types, especially in component libraries. Some of them we're like, well, we'll probably never be able to support this.
Yeah,
so
makes sense.
You know, I guess the end all solution to this is just to remove this runtime requirement of having a known list of props. But in that case, how do we handle fall-through attributes? That's something we will definitely need to discuss, right, in our FCs. And how do we provide a good migration strategy? Like, would be I guess the main difference is when you declare no props at all, everything's going to be treated as props. So there will be no attribute fall-throughs by default because you did not declare any props. Then in that case, how do you maybe only explicit allow the things you want let fall through? I don't know. Like that's something we're open to discussion. It's just the thing we want to do, but also we don't really have fully, you know, thought through what we need to do to get there yet.
That makes sense. And it will probably resolve lots of issues with, like I said, the complex typings or even things like conditional props that are not really possible at the moment.
That would allow us to completely remove all this TypeScript reverse inference stuff and reduce this whole category of bugs. But how to make this compatible with all the existing code bases, that's the most concerning part. But all the things I mentioned for V4, none of these are set in stones. These are just things we're thinking. Every single one of them will have to go through an RFC process. And it's probably not going to happen very soon because we're right now still focusing on 3.5.
So it's more aimed for like not this year.
Definitely not this year.
Definitely this year.
Yeah.
That's always good, like not to give a date or something, just like a time range. Saying, okay.
It's like all these breaking changes we're thinking right now are super conservative. Like we want to just like start thinking about collecting these things early and start the discussion early. So we have this process of getting feedback, prepping the community on where we are heading, and then finding a good timing to eventually do this.
Makes sense. And you already mentioned 3.5 and Vapor.
Yeah.
So I think these are also two very important parts the community is interested in, as in like what comes in Vue 3.5, and of course the current state of Vapor mode. Feel free to choose what's maybe faster to discuss or what could be more interesting, and then we go for one and the other.
Yeah, well, we'll do both. I think 3.5 right now, It's already in alpha state. Actually, there is an alpha version of 3.5 already. It comes with the first significant change is internal reactivity refactor, take 2. This time, it's mostly memory usage improvement. So it uses like almost 60% less memory, which is going to be great if you have large data collections or huge applications. And then it works a lot better when you are iterating over large reactive arrays. We optimize all these array methods individually. So in some cases, it can be like 10 times faster. So if you have like large data collections in your app, you'll probably see performance improvements in 3.5. And then another thing, I need to pull up the list because there
There's so many good things.
yeah. We improved the internal define component type. So this is a bit internal. It took a bit of effort, but we had some big internal type improvements that also made it easier for the IDE for Volar to more accurately infer your prop types, especially when when you're using define props with a type syntax. It is now able to use the verbatim types, and in the future, we're also going to add things like if you write a comment, js.comment documentation for your props, it'll show up when you are consuming that component and like looking through the props. So these are the like quality of life improvements. That's kind of need to sync with Volar in a way. And then let's see, props Destructure. We're stabilizing that in 3.5. I basically made a final call in the RFC, trying to solicit last minute feedback. And I don't think, interestingly, so it definitely has some people who don't like it, but I think the more valuable feedback comes from people who've actually used it in their production apps. And almost every single one of them have actually used it at scale in their real projects, came back with positive feedback. And they're like, we love this. The team loved this. We want to see this feature be stabilized. At the same time, there are a few people who are really skeptical. They're like, we probably will never use this. So we do provide a flag for you to just disable it in your project if you don't want to see it ever. So that is Reactive Props Destructure. I personally love it. There are some lengthy discussions from the RFC talking about the mental overhead and pros and cons. If you're interested, you can check it out. But
link in the show notes, of course.
Yeah. But I personally think it's a big quality of life improvement for the average use case. And also, we're working on something in Volar to kind of sync with this change again. I think it's interesting because a lot of features we do now kind of like we're trying to think about how the IDE angle can improve certain features that's purely from framework level, right? For example, like when you destructure a prop, that prop is actually kind of a special variable. Volar can actually know those variables and inject something like an inlay hint before it. So that when you're looking at down the component somewhere, you see a variable, you don't have to like go to definition. You know it's a reactive prop right there. So you won't ever get confused.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Plus,
nice.
I guess in addition, there are probably also many people, at least I see that in quite some projects, who are already destructuring props without knowing that loses reactivity. So probably there will also be lots of problems solved just by bringing out 3.5 at some point.
Yeah, the nice thing about the Destructure is if it worked before without reactivity, it probably continued to work with reactivity, right? Unless you were explicitly trying to get the initial value of the prop without ever expecting it to change. Like, so the case I think is going to be extremely rare where you think like this prop will likely change, but you only want to get the initial value. Like, I think that's just a weird use case.
Yeah. You also wouldn't do it that way then if you actually like explicitly want that, but
yeah,
you never know.
Yeah, so other than that, we're thinking about some other things in 3.5, use ID. I think Nux team has been asking this for a while. Then another thing called useTemplateRef, where right now the way template refs work is you have to declare a normal ref, then you match that ref's variable name to the ref string in the template, which I very long time felt this is kind of weird, right? So it also creates an issue because, for example, if a composable needs to work with a template ref in your template, you have to declare that template ref in your main setup block and then feed it into the external composable. So the usage is kind of annoying to some extent. So useTemplateRef is going to be this, like, you pass it a string key, and that string key matches whatever thing is in your template. And then this useTemplateRef can be actually called in nested composables, which means you can create a composable that is expected to work with a template ref, without having to explicitly have the user create it and pass it to you. It can actually create it and then return it.
The only thing is you have to document that the template ref is this and this name then when you use the composable. That's the only downside, I guess.
Yeah. So your composable can also allow the user to customize the key.
That's a good point, actually. Yeah, you can pass the key in then. Yeah.
So I think this would unlock a different category of composables that work with the DOM and kind of like serve as a replacement for directives. So incidentally, this is because when we're implementing Vapor, we noticed that the directive system is actually quite a bit of an overhead in the Vapor system. And it's just, it feels like a lot of the things custom directives can do can be done with composables nowadays. So I guess in the future, we may also consider, like, should directives still be part of Vue? But again, that's a super, super early thought. Because we don't really see a lot of people that use that. And some people may prefer it, but in a way, we tend to more and more treat directives as a compiler hint rather than a runtime construct. So having more custom directives in the whole flow actually makes the template just less optimizable in many cases. That's what we discovered when we're working on Vapor. So yeah, something we're trying to think about. And then something like SSR-related improvements, lazy hydration. So the way it works is it's going to be using async components as the boundary. And when you define an async component, you can define when to trigger the load of this component. So you can defer the load of the component on a specific condition, like on viewport or on hover or on interaction. So only when that condition is met will the corresponding chunk for that component be actually fetched, and the hydration will only happen at that point. So it really is just like an additional option to define async component. And most of the things should be pretty non-obtrusive to the end user. And then we also want to introduce something that allows you to basically explicit allow hydration mismatches in certain parts of your app. Like, for example, like when you're dealing with dates, sometimes it's just, right? Like, because your date on the server and on the client will never match. So in this case, you want to always override it with the client data. So in this case, you can maybe add a data attribute called like data allow mismatch equals, prefer client. And now, when it comes to the hydration of this specific node, Vue will just say, okay, let's just let the client value override whatever. Like it'll just like adopt the client value in this case. But this is kind of like what we're thinking. The implementation details actually still needs a bit of work. Like we may have to restrict it only to certain types of bindings, like primitive values that can be like retrieved from the client. And then there could also be a value called prefer server, which means don't override it with the client rendered result. Just keep whatever the server is. So prefer server will be more tricky because it needs to adopt the already rendered value, like extract it back. So we may not actually be able to implement that fully. So prefer client is more straightforward.
That makes sense. It sounds a bit like, though, that this could be used as an escape hatch for lots of things. It's like, oh, there's an hydration error. Let's just throw in that little
I think
allow hydration.
Earlier, we kind of always had to like wrap it with like client only, but that's kind of not ideal because it's like blank, and then it kind of you have to wait the whole hydration to complete, then it kind of kicks in. But if you can still render it on the server and then let the client override it or whatever, I think that's probably a bit more flexible.
Also sounds a bit like more progressive in terms of like, okay, you still have something. You don't have to define a fallback component. You can just go with the component as is and then say, hey, that value, let's skip that and use the client one. Very nice. So 3.5, lots of SSR improvements, internal type improvements as well, and the lazy hydration topic. On that, do you plan on like custom ways of triggering the hydration to say like, okay, that async component, not like, I don't know, on scroll, on interact, as you said, but like more defining a custom way of triggering it? Or is it, will it only be...
Probably. Okay. Like if you pass a function to the condition, like, yeah, that could definitely be a way to do that. Like it gives you a function to call. You call that and the thing just happens. It's like a callback. Or you return a promise, maybe. I don't know. Like
that could also work.
It's going to be pretty open-ended. I think a promise would probably be nice.
And that also means that the JavaScript and the CSS, if it's like the scope CSS, will only be downloaded when the hydration kicks in.
CSS splitting has to do with your build setup. So I think Vue by default splits the CSS along with the async component chunk and loads them in parallel, which means, so the CSS will also only be loaded when the chunks are fetched. But that's kind of like, it depends on your build setup. Yeah.
Fair. Yeah. All right. Then we have the latest and greatest news for 3.5 is the alpha build is already out, as I said, so people can try it. And of course, everybody's happy for feedback.
Alpha is not feature complete yet. Some of the things we talked about is not in the alpha yet.
Also important to notice, so people trying it out be like, hey, the preferred client doesn't work yet because it's not in there yet. Yes. But maybe at the time while you're listening to that, maybe 3.5 is already out. Maybe you're trying the next alpha, who knows? So definitely give the whole thing a shot and try out the features that are implemented already. Then of course we come to the maybe one more thing before Weber mode. Quite some people were asking about suspense. Like I remember when we had when you had to talk at Vue.js Live earlier this year, said suspense. It's also a matter of writing an RFC, stabilizing it, and it will happen probably this year.
Yeah. Suspense is an interesting one because the RFC just takes a long time to write. It's been draft status for a long time. I think at this stage, a lot of funny thing is something just happened in the React ecosystem. I'm not sure how many Vue users are aware of it, but React 19 made a very significant change about how suspense worked and didn't even like document it very prominently. And that turns out to break a lot of assumptions in user land, like the whole React query would just like not work as efficiently as they want it to be with this change. So Next.js probably also. It's just like the way that React team expected they want suspense to work turns out to be misaligned with how the community has been using it. So I think that's the kind of the thing. We kept Vue suspense in experimental status mostly because in the early days I was like, I'm not sure if this is how we want the API to look like, because there are some things like error handling and all that. But after all this time, I'm starting to feel like the basic use case is fine, because we don't really see people raise very specific concerns or requests about how they want suspense to change. So that probably shows it's actually in a pretty good place. And also, I don't think many people, I think, like, for example, it's used in Nuxt. It's used in, for example, Trust.js, I think. And they've all been just using it just fine. So I don't think we'll expect to go through like big API changes with suspense. It'll just likely land as disruptively as possible. It's just gonna, one day we're just like, oh, suspense isn't stable now. You can finally stop seeing that experimental warning in your console.
Yeah. I think for me, I've been like suspense. I dug into it a while ago, but for the most part, I've just been like, it's been like an invisible feature for me that Nuxt uses internally, and like I don't really think about it a whole lot.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way of having it.
Yeah, I think suspense, we were unsure about it when we implemented it because it cut across a lot of different areas, like keep alive, transition, especially suspense with transition, is very tricky. We fixed a lot of suspense related bugs over time. I think that's kind of like,
Teleports.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's like we kind of put it in experimental because we know there are bugs. Like we want to take the time to fix all those bugs before we can comfortably say it's stable.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, and I think the other big one we already mentioned it is Vapor mode. So what's the current state on Vapor mode? We know the repository is open source for a while. We have a playground. So how's it going?
I actually just synced with Kevin yesterday. So overall, I think so. If you look at all the features, we're basically at a stage where we're like 90% done for components. And the only thing missing from the component feature is define async component. So that's going to be the next thing. Once we've done that, then the only thing missing is the built-in components. So things like transition, keep alive, suspense. So these are going to be a bit difficult, but before we dive into those built-in components, we want to then start to work on test coverage. Actually, first, performance tuning. So we want to do, it's kind of like a milestone where like, oh, components are done now. We should like take a look at the performance again, see if there are like room for optimization. Once we've done the performance tuning, we will then do the hydrations support. So because the way Vapor works is server-side compilation of SFC will be exactly the same for normal virtual DOM components and Vapor components. So both virtual DOM components and Vapor components will be able to hydrate from the same HTML output. And the early version of Vapor's runtime that I built actually already had hydration handled, but as these new features were added in, some of them were added without hydration support. So now we need to basically catch up with that and make sure all the features implemented up to this point are hydration supported. And then next is Kevin actually just posted a small roadmap, but after that, I think it is interop. Yeah, test coverage, performance tracking, as hydration, async component, then built-in components. Before we dive into built-in components, though, we'll probably try to get Vapor mode running in VPress. Because so once we have hydration, once we have async component, these are the two key things. So these are the only two things missing from Vapor mode that allows us to just run all the components in the default theme in VPress, because it's a pretty limited. Actually, I think the default theme probably uses transition in a few places, so we have to like run it without transition. But other than that, it doesn't do anything crazily complex. So our hope is to be able to get a build of VPress to be running entirely on Vapor mode. Actually, it doesn't require any change in VPress itself. It's like we want to get Vapor to a place where we can just like add the Vapor attribute to all the components in the default theme, and it'll just work. I think that's a good milestone that we hope to hit later this year. And once we do that, I think Vapor can be, considered in beta status.
Sweet. Okay, so we definitely
Exciting.
We will most likely see a beta later this year as soon as that milestone is hit.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah, that's really good news. And in terms of performance tuning, do you have any, let's say, milestone that you want to reach there, maybe compared to Vue 3 at the moment, or also to other frameworks in the JS benchmark?
So Kevin is actually working on that as we speak. So he's going to set up a continuous CI tracking on CI to basically, because previously he was basically in he and the Vapor team is mostly in kind of feature mode. It's like, let's get these implemented and cover as many features as possible. And then it's like periodically, then we go back into performance mode. So it's going to require a lot of profiling. I think because of all the feature added, the performance definitely probably regressed from the last time I benchmarked it. Last time is much faster than current Vue 3. It's we're using JS Framework benchmark as kind of the reference. So we'll see how the latest number are at, and I think there are definitely room for optimization we're going to do. So basically the next few weeks, that's the focus of the Vapor team. So we'll have some updated numbers probably after that.
Nice. Yeah, we'll also share them as soon as they're out. That's perfect. So it's already been over 1.5 hours talking.
Yeah.
We still have a long list of questions. Of course, we won't make it for all of them. But that also means we would like to have you a second time on here at least, if you'd be up for that.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we can do that.
Nice. Then maybe there are like, I think, two important ones from the community that I've seen like super, like lots of people are interested in on Reddit, but also on Twitter, on LinkedIn, and on the YouTube comments. So maybe the first one is all around Volar, maybe all related around the 2.0 release, the weird VS Code marketplace bug and so on. So basically someone was asking, what's the plan for addressing the, say, quote unquote instability in Vue language tools since it's 2.0 release? That's what a user wrote. So.
I actually talked to Johnson a while ago, and to be honest, like it's kind of difficult, and most of the reason it's difficult is because probably reproducing language tooling errors is kind of difficult. Like a lot of users reporting issues to us don't know how to like help us reproduce it. So Johnson has literally fixed every single reproducible issue. He was able, like everything that he was able to actually reproduce, he fixed them, right? Wow. So, but we still constantly hear about this and that. So I think there was a period when 2.0 was just out. There was like really unfortunate timing where VS Code also shipped things on their side that just broke Volar entirely in some cases. But that's why I posted on Twitter a while ago trying to, solicit more feedback. But the thing is, Volar's problem can relate to a lot of things. It can relate to your operating system, your VS Code version, your Node.js version, your Vue version, your Volar version, right? And a lot of times people, when they are showing us like a screenshot without any of these information, it's like we don't even know where to start. Yeah. But Johnson's trying his best. Like if you can provide him something that is strictly reproducible, he's definitely going to fix it, right? So the problem is if you run into these issues, help us with real reproductions. Give us the most precise, most detailed possible information about your environment so we know we can like pinpoint the real issue. Other than that, it's like, we're trying our best to fix whatever we can see, but if we cannot reproduce it, then it's going to be difficult for us to really address them. But I think some of the more disrupting problems, like caused by upstream VS Code, I think has been fixed. And there was also like a period after 2.0, because we republished the original extension and got VS Code Marketplace confused. So a lot of users were actually stuck on a separate instance of the extension and never upgraded. So like keep hitting those bugs that might have already been fixed. I think that has been resolved in the marketplace now. And like personally for me, I've been using it and it's just working well for me. So I never actually experienced any of the problems people ran into. So yeah, so it's challenging because like when you do a big release in Vue language tools, I think it's definitely something we should, it's a lesson learned. Like when we do these like big refactors in language tooling, which can be more difficult to predict in terms of the impact, we should probably be a bit more conservative. Like for Vue core right now, we have like this. Every patch release before we run through ecosystem CI, and it's just immensely helpful. Like because you can unknowingly break things. So I think at some time we may want to set up a more extensive integration test suite for language tools as well. But the thing is, Johnson is he is working on open source full time, mostly through sponsorships as well. So I think people should just give him more appreciation instead of trying to pile on the negative reviews. It's really, really hurtful sometimes. Like we see some of the reviews just being really mean to the maintainers. And Johnson actually is going through some really, big stress during those periods. He was like, these comments just make me don't want to work on this anymore, right? And I don't think that's going to help anyone. the best thing you can do is to give fully reproducible bug reports to help us fix them, right? That helps yourself too. So being mean to people just really doesn't help anyone.
100%. Totally agreed. And there's literally no reason to do that. Instead, just take your time instead of writing a mean review to find a bug to reproduce it. and also that's also what people forget usually. All these tools are out there for free to use. You don't pay anything.
Yeah.
You don't have a monthly subscription to run it. So come on. All right. Then the last big thing from the Q&A, which we'll probably do today, and then maybe a personal question from the two of us, and then that's that. Maybe the longest interview ever, the longest conversation here.
Yeah.
So lots of people were wondering, especially in other frameworks ecosystem like React with React Native and Expo and so on, how is, let's say, the native mobile app story for Vue.js?
Yeah, I get asked this a lot. The short answer is the Vue team really don't have the bandwidth to come up with a native solution of our own. It's just too much work. It's like entirely different scope to build a native rendering layer. The only thing we can do is to make Vue flexible enough to be plugged into something that can do that. For example, NativeScript, right? And I guess the problem with NativeScript is just doesn't have big enough community, not enough references or resources you can find, but still, it seems people have been successfully building projects with it, right? And the cool thing is NativeScript actually works with Vue, works with even Svelte and Solid and other things. So I would recommend giving it a try first. And also, if your app use case doesn't really have super advanced UI requirements, you can get by with Ionic or what's it called, Capacitor. Yeah. Going full native, I guess the problem is, I think the closest option if you want truly native stuff is NativeScript, but you definitely still need to have a certain level of expertise of actual native development to be able to handle something like that. Even for React Native, that's the case, right? It's the only upside is you can reuse a lot of your framework specific knowledge in those cases, but it doesn't mean you can just build a native rendering app without any native knowledge. If you want that, you should probably go with Capacitor because that's truly web. Anything that looks like web but renders to native, it's native underneath, and you need to understand how it works.
That makes sense. And so TLDR, basically NativeScript, give it a try if you need actual native features. And if you basically need a web app running in a mobile app container, that Capacitor is a good way to go.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks a lot for that.
So this last question here is one from the community as well as something that I wanted to ask you. So we'll do this as the last one here. So I do lots of content creation. So does Alex. And so I was wondering, what would you like to see content creators do more of? And what ways do you see content as helping the Vue ecosystem as a whole? That's maybe a big question. You can just pick one part from that and answer it if you want.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's fun to have more people just live stream building Vue apps. You see Adam Wathan does that a lot for Tailwind. He would do a stream and let's span out this design in 20 minutes. And he would just use Tailwind CSS and just quickly build that really, really fast. I think that's a really, really good way to showcase how a tool he created, how productive he can be with it. And I think seeing someone working on from zero to a Vue app, especially if you can getting the flow while you're doing that, I think people will naturally realize how cool that is. Doesn't have to be a big, complex app, because I think it will be pretty hard for viewers to get halfway into it. You're already digging into some really specific things, small things like a Sudoku game or a to-do MVC, maybe something that's slightly more complex than to-do MVC, or I think a mini series could be let's replicate all the official Vue examples from ground zero. Don't look at the solution. Let's try to build them ourselves. How will we build it? Then compare notes with the official implementation. Something like that will be interesting. It also complements the official documentation in a way.
Good idea. So you would say like more, let's say, live examples could be really helpful just to showcase the power of the framework and like how you'd write or like how you would start writing.
I think there are enough abstract discussions on like why you should use this, why you should use that, like a coding style and all that. I think what I don't see often enough is just like people showcasing how happy and productive they are with actually when they're actually using Vue. If I had more time, I would do this myself. I think it's going to be pretty fun. Anthony Fu I think does that on occasionally. I think Kevin also did that on the Chinese streaming platforms when he was working on Vapor. Some stuff like that is cool.
Yeah, Anthony has great content. Same like for Daniel streaming. He's also often like maintaining like streaming maintenance work, but also like building things with Nuxt as well. So that's always lovely to see. Also links, of course, to channels as usual in the show notes or description.
At one point, like there are a lot of things I feel like could be a bit more fun, I guess, for the users. Like in general, like I feel like we have a lot of content that's focused on teaching you how to do stuff, but there's probably not a lot of like just sort of an ongoing theme that everyone's just happy to follow along every week. It's not necessary because they want to like learn something to get a job, but because I feel like, this podcast is one example where like people can follow along. Like every week there's going to be something. For video content, it's the same. It's like, every week we can find some interesting topic. I guess that falls into content creator territory, which I am myself not an expert in. But I think there's a balance between being intentionally controversial. I think a lot of YouTubers fall into that trap of trying to come up with crazy stuff, crazy thumbnails, and just create controversial for no reason. But at the same time, like I feel the Vue community is a bit too, I guess, serious sometimes. It's like we could have some more lighthearted stuff where just keep people more engaged.
So focusing on entertainment more than just like straight education. Keep things
like make some
more
memes,
Yeah.
Friendly memes could be fun.
Yeah.
I feel like HTMX has been really, really successful with their meme marketing.
For sure. Yeah, they did really good on that.
Yeah. But this also takes talent. It's like some people are just naturally good with coming up with like viral memes.
That's true. Yeah. Talent and time as well. Like it's not easy to create good content. Of course, it's
definitely. Yeah.
That's the other thing. But yeah, and would you say the amount of content in the Vue ecosystem is like on a good level? Could be more, too much? Do you have a feeling for that?
I think there's a decent amount, but honestly, I haven't watched all the content out there. There's actually a lot, right? So for me personally, it's like there's a part that's a bit more entertaining oriented. That's mostly for community engagement, trying to, attract people and keep them feel like they're part of a community that's just having fun on the same topic. And then there's the part where it's like more advanced, like how to write a good composable, right? Like I feel like some of the Alex content touches upon that. I think, like that line of content is also good because I feel like not enough people talk about that. Or not enough people talk about it in a very digestible way, I guess. Quality also really matters. So even if it's the same topic, explained by different people can have different effects. So sometimes it's actually nice to have different takes on the same topic from different perspectives. I guess like I myself don't watch enough of the content because most of the time I see the description, see the thumbnail. I'm like, okay, I know what this is probably talking about. I don't really spend the full 20 minutes watching the whole thing through. So I might be wrong in some cases.
A bit different for you because it's often just teaching things about the thing you created. And so like,
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey, I know this.
Probably,
I did this
yeah.
thing.
Yeah,
That's
it's funny
true.
because like in the Chinese Vue community, there's a meme talking about like I don't understand, I don't know Vue, like Evan Yu doesn't know Vue. That's the ongoing meme in the Chinese community. Because there was one time someone posted a Vue interview question of a Chinese company, and I think I looked at one of the questions. I'm like, I don't know, and people just felt like, oh, even you don't know how to answer this question. You probably don't know Vue that well. So it's like, yeah.
That reminds me of like, oh yeah, I look someone with 12 years of Vue experience, like that kind of post from like
Yeah.
recruiters.
Yeah.
Ah, crazy.
Yeah. The meme got a lot of like remixes. Like people would extend with like when they sometimes on social network there's me, someone posted a video of me and they would be like, this guy looks really smart. I'd be willing to offer him like $500 a month to work for me.
Okay, so if we learn at least one thing, more memes, folks. We need more memes. Send us your best Vue.js memes. Tag DejaVue, Vue.js, Evan as well. He will look at some of them and will laugh a lot. But yeah, I think all thanks a lot, Evan, for coming along. There was almost 2 hours now of Q&A content around Vue mainly. We didn't even touch on the Vue part that much. So it's also something for the next time. Yeah, to everyone who listened until here, probably in like small steps, or binge it all at once when it comes out. Yeah, thank you for joining. Take a look at the other episodes. So of course there's a big backlog, or maybe when you're listening to it, also some more episodes, maybe our next one with Evan, who knows. Yeah, thanks for listening, and we are looking forward to have you on board again, and wish you a pleasant evening, and to everyone listening, a wonderful day. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.